Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Caffe Lena. Welcome to Storytelling Night. Thank you so much for being here. If anyone is unfamiliar with our storytelling format, if this is your first visit to our storytelling night, normally what we do is an open mic. So it's a community event where really anyone is welcome to come up and tell stories. They get a 10-minute slot, and then we have a featured storyteller who has a half-hour slot. About a year ago, we transitioned to live streaming these events, and before we were able to welcome anybody back into the room, the format we decided on was 3 featured storytellers. So these are people from all over the capital region, sometimes beyond, who may have been a featured storyteller for the open mic events and now are coming back to share the stage as all featured storytellers. So they all have about half an hour to tell their stories. Some choose to fill out with one long story. Some do several shorter stories. So we'll see what we have tonight. Tonight, Frank is going to kick it off, and then we have Lorraine and Sue following him. They will actually introduce each other as they go, and we'll have just about a minute break in between all of them. So that's really all I have to share with you tonight. For those of you watching online, we really appreciate you being here. Since we've started live streaming these storytelling events, it's actually been a really good way for us to include people from further away that might not have been able to participate before. And if you're out there watching and can visit the tip jar tonight and send a little bit of support, it's split evenly between all of our storytellers and Caffe Lena. And everything that comes in really helps us continue running these programs, continue putting on our spoken word performance nights, and our community events. So we really appreciate you being here again, and hope you have a wonderful night. So without further ado, I will introduce Frank Wind, who is our first featured storyteller. Thanks.
I get to take this off. It's a pleasure being here. It was late January a couple of years ago. In fact, it was January 25th. The place was packed. There must have been 60, 70, or 80 people there. And most of the men were wearing kilts. And based upon their plaids, I could see that most of the major clans were represented. At the appointed hour, we were all asked to stand, pick up our glasses, which were filled with a delightful single malt whiskey, and we were asked to toast to the Scottish poet laureate, Robbie Burns, on what would have been his 260th birthday. And then out from the kitchen on these trolleys came the haggis, resplendent in its coating, glistening coating of whiskey cream sauce, followed by tubs of neeps and tatties. We'll get into that. Neeps and tatties are mashed rutabaga or turnips and mashed potatoes. And now for the haggis. Well, there were 2 kinds. We'll talk about the first one first. The haggis I'm going to talk about is the traditional Scottish soft sausage. And you make it by chopping up some onions, toasting some oats, mixing those together with a number of spices, including mace, and then you add a generous portion of ground organ meats from as many organs as you can find on the interior of a sheep. And you stuff that all into a sheep's stomach. And then you first boil it, and then you bake it, and then, yes, you eat it. If you go over to Scotland now, it's not January, it's not Robbie Burns' birthday, but you go into the supermarket and look in the freezer case, you will find them there. or you can find them in the butcher shop. It's a delight. And now for the other haggis. At the end, during the Ice Age, Scotland was covered with a thick mantle of ice. But as the Ice Age ended and ice all retreated, Scotland became a marvelous hardwood forest. And then man came. They liked the area. They came up from the south. They liked the area, so they started cutting down as many trees as they could for habitation purposes and for agriculture. And as they were cutting them down, they cut into the forest and they found in the clearings an animal which they had never seen before. Now, I'm not talking about Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster, or some other fictitious creature, which today becomes the focus and the driving force for a traditional Scottish advertising campaign for the tourist trade. I'm talking about the haggis. Now, once man cleared the trees out, all of these nice rolling hills became grass covered. These series of rolling hills, which geomorphologists today describe as a Lollobrigidian landscape. The haggis came out, and it was perfect. They could simply walk all over these hills, eating the grasses. Now, what we know about the haggis actually comes from incisement and scratches in many of the tall standing stones that are present throughout Scotland and the western and northern outer islands. And they described that this animal that was, well, it could be about the size of a small goat, but whereas goats are narrow in the hip and have longer legs, the animal they were illustrating had short legs and was sort of broad in the beam, and it had some sort of fur based on what they were sketching. And incising, you could probably describe it best as a coffee table with fur. But it was fine, and it came out and it ate all the grasses, and it was great. But the problem was man brought with him sheep. Have you ever been in a country where they raise lots of sheep? This was not good for the haggis because what was heaven became hell. The sheep with their sharp little hooves would go pounding all around these hillsides, making these very narrow, deep furrows, concentric furrows. And it's fine for the sheep to do that because they would walk in one little track the same way you and I may have walked on the curb on our way to high school or something like that. But for the haggis, this wasn't going to work because if they put legs in one track and then the other legs in an adjacent track, be it upper or lower, on the steeper slopes, they would tip over and go bouncing down the hill into the North Sea. They were terribly threatened. But Mother Nature comes through at times like this. And some haggis were born with legs longer on one side. Why are you laughing? Than on the other. This was the perfect solution. In fact, two distinct populations developed, those with longer legs on one side and those with longer legs on the other. It was a perfect solution. Now, Dee and I go over to Scotland every year to see the country, to refresh our friendships, and I go with cameras at the ready to photograph the haggis. This will be our 14th time there. For Dee, her 14th time, and my 10th. I have not yet photographed a haggis. I can't show you any pictures of the haggis, so you're simply going to have to take my word for it. But if you don't believe me, just find a Scotsman and ask him about the haggis, and he'll tell you the exact same story. Now, as I said, we go over to Scotland quite often, and a number of years ago, we were invited to, we found there was a notice by Icelandic Air. If you flew from a New York airport to Edinburgh, you could stop off in Reykjavik for a whole week at no extra charge. Now, we'd never been to Iceland, so that's what we decided to do. We flew into Reykjavik, and when we got there, we signed up for what they call the Golden Circle Tour, which is a full-day van drive around most amazing geologic phenomena you will find anywhere in the world. They had beautiful glacier in the distance. You've never seen waterfalls like they've got up there. Spectacular waterfalls. And since this is a volcanic area, you'd see bubbling mud pits. We actually saw two girls cooking eggs in a basket over a steam vent. And they also had geysers. And late in the day, we were in the town of Geysir, waiting for their namesake geyser to erupt. And as it erupted, I was washed over by the mist from the geyser, but also a feeling of remorse or shame for something I had done way back in my youth, well, when I was in college. See, I was a geology major, and I was going to Queens College. And part of the curriculum for getting the degree is you had to take a summer field course in field geology. And the year I was going to be taking it, we were going to be going to the Klamath National Forest in Northern California. And we were roughing it pretty much. We were camping out as much as we could. So we had 2 vehicles and a trailer. And we were heading west, looking at all these marvelous geologic features that you really can't appreciate in a textbook. And one stop we were going to have before we got to California was in Wyoming to see Old Faithful. As we were breaking camp one day, one of my fellow classmates, Ramsey Dabby, noticed this very large truck steering wheel sitting on the side of the road. And being a scavenger of sorts, he picked it up and stuffed it into the trailer. And then we went on to Old Faithful. We got there early in the morning. There was nobody else around. We got to watch one eruption. And we found out the eruptions pretty much happen between 45, they're spaced about 45 minutes to about an hour and a quarter apart. Well, Ramsey had an idea. He ran back to the trailer, got the wheel, and on the way back, he found a piece of metal pipe. And he ran out onto the boardwalk as close as he could to the mouth of the geyser, stuck the pipe in the ground, put the wheel on top of it, and then backed off. And we're just sitting around there waiting for the people to show up. And when we can just feel it was just about to start, we all yelled, "All right, Ramsey, open her up!" So he goes running out there. And then he runs back out, turns it the other way, pulls the wheel off of the metal pipe, and we just got our asses out of there. Now, I hope that those who witnessed that have since then developed a better understanding of what the natural world is really like. When I was 15 and my brother Jonathan was 12, my parents felt we were mature enough that they could leave us for about a week when they went overseas. This would be the first time they went overseas. And this was one of these 8-day, 6-country runs through Europe. You know, if this is Tuesday, it must be Belgium. So that's what they did, and I think they enjoyed it very much. But they would check into a hotel in a new city, probably a new country. And my father was an artist. He painted watercolors. He was very good. And what he would do is when he was traveling, he would photograph everything he wanted to see. And he would have films, he would have it on slides, and he would back project it onto a piece of mylar and paint from there. So he was gone quite often during the day taking pictures. He had a whole bandolier of film canisters. And then my mother had her task, which was to walk the streets to find souvenirs. Back then, you had to bring souvenirs for everybody. And if you're in so many different countries, you got to get as many as you can. So she's walking down the street, and she's looking here and looking here, looking here. But the problem was my mother only spoke English. And they were in countries where they don't always speak English. It's not their native tongue. So she would walk into a street bazaar or see something in a store window, and if she was fancied it, she'd go in and ask, does anyone here speak English? And it worked fairly well. They were quite amenable to helping her. So they went country by country by country. She used that same technique, and it worked very well until they got to the last country. And then she was walking down the street next to this major department store, and she looked in the window, and she saw a cap that she wanted me to have. So she went in, and she asked, does anyone here speak English? And they all just simply looked at her. This was a long time ago. I was 15 at the time. I still have the cap. She was walking past Harrods. This is my deerstalker hat from Harrods. How do I look, Dr. Watson? What's next on the list? When I was, as a geologist, I was studying a special group of microfossils. And I had come up with some really interesting things I wanted to share with my colleagues. So I submitted an abstract for the next meeting of the North Central section of the Geological Society of America, which was going to be held in Columbus, Ohio. They accepted my abstract, and I flew out to Columbus. And the way the GSA meetings worked, there were generally 2 or 3 days of technical sessions, but they were preceded by, if the area was amenable to that, field trips to see the local geology. And South and Central Ohio had a great interest for me because it was the same age as the rocks that I had been studying. So I signed up for the trip, and we did our tooling around the country, but the last stop, the one that I had hoped we could get to, was in southern Ohio, just north of Cincinnati, the Bear Creek Quarry on US Highway 52. Now, back then, US Highway 52 is just a narrow 2-lane highway. In fact, I looked at Google Map. It hasn't changed much since then. And it was an abandoned quarry. The bus driver pulled off on the side. We all got out, and then we sort of had to hop down onto the ramp that led down into this abandoned quarry. We hiked down to the bottom, but before we could go terribly far, we were stopped, and the leader of our tour, Dr. Walter Sweet from Ohio State, gave us an explanation as to what was in front of us. And then we were free for about 15 minutes to crawl all over it, take pictures, collect samples, whatever we wanted to do. While we were doing that, Dr. Sweet was approached by the bus driver, Charlie. Excuse me, Dr. Sweet, I need to talk to you. You see the bus? And the bus is on the ramp, at the top of the ramp. See, I pulled onto the ramp to try to turn around, but now the frame of the bus is caught on the edge of the road, and I can't back up and I can't go forward. I think we're stuck. Dr. Sweet looks at Charlie in a state of disbelief, and then he looks at the bus and the ramp, and then he looks at us on the exposure down there, and then back at the ramp again, and then he smiles, although maybe grins would be a better word to use. He says, "Don't worry, Charlie. They'll be finished there in a few minutes, and then we'll get you out of here in no time flat." So he called us all together, apprised us of the situation. And he said, "We've got to get this bus out of the hole it's gotten into. We have to reopen the quarry," which is what we did. We started dragging these thin-bedded limestone slabs, whole piles of them on both sides of the ramp up close to the top. And then when we decided we had enough, we broke into 2 teams, leaners and pavers. And I bet you can understand what they did. The leaners pushed on one side of the bus, which tipped the frame and the wheels slightly, so the pavers could put another layer onto the top of the ramp, all the way to the road. And when that was finished, we went and did the other side. The builders of the pyramids would have been impressed. And we felt so great as we watched the bus actually backing out of the quarry. But then our celebration was rather short-lived because in the process of going down and or coming back up, he had messed up the linkage so he couldn't change gears from the driver's seat. But Charlie was thinking, you know, there's an access panel down here opposite the back door. I think I can get that open. So he finally undid that, and then he instructed one of the guys on the bus, when I call out a number, you see that box down there that's got those numbers on it and the little lever next to it? When I call out a number, you move that lever down next to that number, and I think I can get you home. So with a give me first and a give me second, we headed home. There's one more story coming up. No. I'm trying to find the opening to it. I was invited some time ago to participate in a storytelling conference down in the old country, the land of my birth, Brooklyn. And there were sessions the whole day, and after the morning sessions, which went very well, we had a lunch break. And since the venue was fairly close to where I had been born and raised, I decided to take a trip down memory lane and see what the old neighborhood, the old house looked like. So I got there, and the house hadn't changed too much. The stucco was a little darker, and the shutters, which had been forest green when we lived there, were now a fairly bright red. And we lost the elm tree that was in the front, probably to Dutch elm disease, but there was a nice maple growing there now. But I needed to get some food, so I headed up to the avenue, which was about 3 blocks up. And I went into a produce store there, and that was a produce store that was still there, that was there when I was growing up. I never learned the name of the produce store. My mother always referred to it as Tiffany's because of what they charged. But they had good stuff. Now, back then, Tiffany's, next to Tiffany's was Kaplan's Kosher Meats. But illustrating a change in neighborhood demographics, Kaplan's Kosher Meats had become Cows and Sows. There was also a bakery on the other side that was the home of the most delightful sour rye, northern cornbread, nice bagels, but they disappeared and it was replaced by a children's furniture store. But I needed something to eat, so I went into Tiffany's. And in the middle, they had this basket with the most amazing, enormous navel oranges. I'd never seen them that big, that bright, that perfect. And the aroma from the skins was intoxicating. And I picked it up and I looked at it, and it brought memories back of what it was like when I was living there as a child. My father was the first one to come over to this country. He came in his late teens, got some technical training, got a good job, met the woman who was going to become my mother. They bought a house. The only one who wasn't in this picture at that point was my grandmother, Sophie, who was still back in the old country, her old country, either because of problems with her paperwork or her reticence about leaving the village of her birth. It took her a while to come over here. And when she came, she seemed lost. Her knowledge of English was halting. She didn't really understand a lot of our customs. And she really seemed lost. And my father figured the best way to help her with this was to get her a job. And the job he had set for her was to do the cooking and the shopping, and also to keep an eye on my brother and me. She learned how to work in the kitchen, but then she needed to go shopping. So I remember the day that they headed off, Grandma, hand in hand with my father, going up to the avenue, and he took her to Kaplan's Kosher Meats. He took her to Tiffany's. He took her to the bakery. And he introduced her to all of the people, the girls behind the counter in the bakery. And he said, Mama, just go shopping in these 3 stores. If there's anything else you need, we'll get it for you. The die was cast. On occasion, I had the privilege and the pleasure, although I didn't necessarily appreciate it at the time, of going with Grandma when we went shopping. She'd head off towards the avenue with a two-wheel shopping cart, the rusting one with a squeaky wheel, and she would face off against Kaplan and Kaplan's kosher meats. And using her English, whatever she had, a little bit of Yiddish, gestures, a smile that would melt a glacier, she could get what she wanted. She said, Kaplan, too much fat, lamb chops. Too much fat, too much money. So she got a discount on the lamb chops. She got the same discount on the brisket, the chicken, liver, whatever she wanted. She could always talk him down a little bit. And then she went next door to Tiffany's. If the banana had spots, they shouldn't be charging full price. If there was a bruise on the peach, they shouldn't charge full price. She got discounts on that. Then she went into the bakery. She'd go over to the bagels. Too few seeds, too much money. You got to have good seeds. And she could always sense which rye bread or which challah or which pumpernickel was the first one to have come out of the oven. She could somehow sense it, talk to it. And therefore, that demanded it was old, it demanded a reduction in the price. So she would do that shopping, and then she'd come home, and she would cook. She cooked up a storm. We ate well. I ate a little too well. And I didn't learn until after she was gone. And Grandma never knew that at the end of every month, my father would go into those stores and pay up the difference between what she had paid and what anyone else would have paid. They say it takes a village to raise a child, but it's great when that village can also be accommodating for those at the other end of life's journey. Thank you. Lorraine, where are you?
I'm right here. You want me to introduce myself?
I had you written down, but I don't know
You
where.
have me written down? I've been written up, but I've never been written
All right, here we go. All right. I love this woman.
Use your mic, Frank.
Okay. Lorraine Hartin-Gelardi, it's the woman over there, delights in sharing the spoken word and has been telling stories for 30 years to audiences of all ages. She is ecstatic to emerge from the Zoom cocoon and share tables with live audience, even if they are masked and socially distanced. I love listening to her stories, as will you. Thank you.
And what do you do with it now, right? So how are y'all? You good? You can speak up louder. I don't mind. I like to know you're there. I am so glad to be here. I am not kidding. It is so wonderful to be able to actually look out and see people who aren't in little boxes. And I don't have to go, would you please unmute yourself? When really what I want to say is just stay muted, please. Have you been there? So thank you, Frank, for that wonderful story about your grandmother. I will keep that in my memories. That is just a beautiful story. And I want to thank Caffe Lena. For those of us who love to tell stories or sing songs or dance or perform in front of live people. The way that Caffe Lena has worked to stay open during these difficult times, I really give them a round of applause. Why don't you all give them a round of applause? Yeah. And tonight I want to thank Reese and Ian for the sound equipment, for actually marking my mic with my name on it. Oh, I do. Thank you. And of course, Christy and Margaret and Janine, who have made this such a wonderful place to come. So my license plate says storyteller, STRYTELR, because New York State will not let you put too many letters on the license plate. But you know, having a license plate that says storyteller is really kind of fun, because people will come up to you and they'll go, storyteller? And then you have to explain what you do. But the best thing that happened to me in regard to my license plate was one day I was at the gas station pumping gas in my car. And a man pulled up behind me waiting his turn, but then he got out of the car. And he looks at my license plate and he goes, storyteller? I go, yeah, it's what I do. Uh-huh. Have you ever heard of the Greek myths? Well, yeah, I have. He said, you know, I train police officers. If you want to know who you are as a human being, if you want to know how to live, the Greek myths are what you need to know. And that's what I use to train my officers. And you know, I couldn't agree with him more. When I was 12 years old, I fell in love with a Greek myth, the story of Feyeton. And I have carried that story with me ever since. So let me tell you a little bit about Feyeton. You see, Feyeton was different than all the other boys. They all had brown hair and brown eyes. Feyeton had blonde hair and blue eyes. More importantly, they all had fathers. Feyeton's father was never around. And so Feyeton went to his mother. And she would say to him, now, Feyeton, those blue eyes, that blonde hair, well, that's the mark of your father. Oh, really, Mother? Well, who is my father? 'Cause he's not around. And Clymene, his mother, did what parents have been doing for hundreds of years. She dodged the question. Oh, I'll tell you when the time is right. You can imagine how Feyeton felt about that. But when he turned 13, Clymene took him into the forest. And she said, look up and tell me what you see. And Feyeton looked up. I see a golden chariot being pulled by 4 winged horses, but I can't see the driver. The light is just too bright. The driver is your father. That's Helios, the sun god. You are his son. Well, Feyeton did what any 13-year-old would do. He ran off to tell his best friend, Epiphas, I'm the son of a god. Helios is my father. And Epiphas did what every single one of you would have done. You're kidding, right? Well, Feyeton was so angry, he tackled his friend to the ground and started to beat him up. But Epiphas won that fight. Humiliated and angry, Feyeton went home to his mother and said, I have to find my father. Now, I loved that story. I mean, I loved it. I knew where my father was, just in case you were wondering. My father was the guy who was always downstairs in the basement building things. But I loved the story of Feyeton. He was just a year older than I was. And he was trying to figure out who he was. And so was I. Well, Feyeton went, traveled for days, and then he had to climb a steep mountain. And he climbed, and as he climbed, the light became brighter and brighter until he entered a land where the light was so bright, shadows disappeared. And he came to his father's palace. And it was more magnificent than anything he had ever seen in his entire life. He pushed through the luminescent silver doors, and there was his father, sitting on a throne, the light so bright that he had to shield his eyes, and the voice came, "Why are you here, Feyeton?" "To find my father." "Are you my father?" And the sun god removed his crown so that his son could see him. "Yes, I am your father. Feyeton, remove all doubt and fear from your mind. Ask me anything, a favor, and I swear by the river Styx, I will grant it." Can you imagine being 13 and getting that? Well, he thought about it, and the thing that came to Feyeton's mind, the horses and that chariot. "I want to drive the chariot of the sun." No, said Helios, no, anything but that. It takes all of my strength to drive that chariot. You can't. Look, if you doubt my love for you, just look at my face. 13-year-olds do not back down. And Feyeton wouldn't. And Helios couldn't. He had given his sacred word. And so he took his son down to the stables. And he looked at him. "Now listen, the ride you are about to take is treacherous. I mean, you take that chariot too high and you will scorch the heavens. You bring it too low and you will burn Mother Earth. Feyeton, hold tight to the reins. Do not let go." And then the god of the sun took a special ointment and with his own hands rubbed it all over his son to protect him. And when Feyeton stepped into the chariot, he gave the signal and the stable doors opened. Well, the minute those horses' wings began to beat, Feyeton could feel the power. And he began to tremble and shake, and those horses, they knew that he was too weak to drive the chariot, and they began to thrash about. They soared up toward the heavens, and then they descended down to the earth. And Feyeton was so shaken that he had to let go of the reins. They flew so close to Mother Earth that she was set on fire. Plains of grass burst into flame, mountaintops smoked, rivers began to boil, and Mother Earth cried out. And when Zeus saw what was happening, he hesitated for one moment, and then he picked up one of his heaviest lightning bolts and threw it right at the chariot, shattering it into pieces. Feyeton's hair caught on fire. And like a shooting star, he fell out of the sky to his death in the cool waters of the river Adirondacks. Helios was so overcome with grief that he could not shine at full strength for over a year. Clymene, She wouldn't leave the river's edge until Zeus picked her up in his own arms and carried her home. And Feyeton's 3 sisters became trees, sentinels beside the riverside. Their roots grew into the ground. And when you stood nearby and listened, as the wind blew through their leaves, you could hear them whisper, Feyeton, Feyeton, Feyeton. I loved that story. I mean, it had all the drama that a 12-year-old girl wanted. I didn't even mind the fact that Feyeton had died. I mean, isn't it kind of romantic in a way? And the whole story made sense to me because it was all about the topsy-turvy world of teenagerhood, a world I was just about to enter. When I became, when I started my career as a storyteller, well, what do you think was one of the first stories I told? Feyeton. Middle schoolers loved it. And I told it from the perspective of a 12-year-old. At the time, I had 3 children. I still have 3 children, by the way. But at the time, they were little. And then they got to be teenagers. And the story that I had been telling as a 12-year-old, all of a sudden, I was telling it from the viewpoint of Clymene and Helios. I mean, as a parent, hadn't I walked back promises I'd made? Hadn't I given my children tons of advice that I knew they weren't going to pay any attention to? And I kept tight hold on the reins of the chariot because Feyeton lived in my house and his name was Kevin. Now I was standing in the CVS, standing in line on a Tuesday afternoon at 4:15 when the phone rang and I fished through my purse and I flipped it open. Does that tell you something? I flipped it open and I went, hello? What are you doing? It was my son, Kevin. I'm standing in line getting your prom pictures of you and Shauna. Now, I knew that Kevin didn't really care what I was doing. What Kevin wanted to know was, can you come and help me? And so I said, what's up? My car caught on fire. Are you in it? No, but it's completely destroyed. Can you come and get me? Okay, where are you? On the arterial in Poughkeepsie. Well, where on the arterial? Oh, don't worry, Mom. You'll find me. All righty, I said I'll be there in 20 minutes. And so we picked up the pictures. And I got into the car. And as I was driving along, I was trying to figure out which time zone my husband was in. He was away on business because I wanted to call him and figure out which one of us was going to deal with the insurance this time. And then I wanted to ask him if he would let Kevin borrow one of his 2 cars to drive because Kevin was 18 and he had a job and he went to school and he had a girlfriend, and without his chariot, his whip, his ride, he would go crazy. And I'd be standing right there next to him. Now, Kevin's love of all things mechanical started when he was 2 years old. My husband was laying on his back in the driveway underneath our red Nissan station wagon trying to fix something that was broken. And he had all his tools lined up next to him. He reached out from under the car, grabbed a tool. And when Kevin saw that, he grabbed a tool and crawled right underneath to see what was going on. He put pegs on the axles, the rear axle of his bike when he was little, just so he could do wheelies better. And he built himself an 8-foot ramp out of a piece of plywood so he could freestyle and do better wheelies. When he was in 4th grade, he traded up. He had a quad, a starter quad, you know, the all-terrain vehicles with the big 4 wheels that you go whizzing through the woods with. Well, he traded up. He wanted something bigger and better, and so he got the new one, and then he tinkered with the exhaust and removed weight so he could make it go faster. And by 14, he was obsessed with cars. Just before he turned 16, his uncle Andrew, also a car nut, gave him his old red VW GTI, which in its day had been what they tell me is a hot hatch. Well, I don't know what that means. I just know that it was a hot hatch. I think it's supposed to be cool. Anyhow, when he got the car, I went out, and there was Kevin. He was sitting behind the driver's seat, and he had his hand on the steering wheel, and he had this big smile on his face and a dreamy look in his eye. Well, within 2 weeks, Kevin figured out how to put nitrous oxide into the car. Now, I'm going to explain to you what that does, or so I've been told. When you take nitrous oxide and put it on the engine, well, it feeds more fuel in, and that means the fuel burns faster, and that means, or hotter, and that means it goes faster. Kevin got the biggest can of NOS he could find, and when he put that in the car, he rocketed out of our driveway and down the road as if it was the Apollo 13 takeoff. But that big can of NOS wasn't so good for that little GTI engine, and the engine blew up. And I thought the kid would be heartbroken. No, he comes into the house. He goes, "Mom, that was the coolest thing ever." 2 days later, we were at Alco Car Parts, code for junkyard, so that he could buy a new engine to put in the GTI. But we didn't buy an engine. We bought a whole car. An old, broken-down car. Kevin had worked out a deal with my husband, David. David was going to lend him the money, and Kevin would use the engine to put in the GTI, and then David would use the extra parts for one of his car projects. It became a pattern. There would be a mechanical failure. Like the time he bought a secondhand Jeep and the rear axle just snapped. So we'd go get a replacement. Or there'd be driver error. Like the time Kevin spun out on a patch of wet leaves and smashed his car into the guardrail. Or there'd be an act of God. Like the 2 times that Kevin hit a deer, which I couldn't really fault him for because we lived in the woods and the Taconic State Parkway is just a frolicking place for deer. But every time something happened to one of his cars, Kevin would get a replacement, an extra car, because he was going to fix up the broken car. And if he wasn't going to fix up the broken car, well, then his best friend Mark was going to buy the car as soon as he got enough money, and he was going to fix it up. Or David's friend Al was going to buy the car, and he was going to fix it up so he could give it to his daughter. But you know what? Not one of those derelict cars ever left the driveway. And pretty soon, my yard looked an awful lot like the Alco junkyard. But just because those cars didn't go anywhere doesn't mean there wasn't a lot of activity. Oh, no. I came home one afternoon, And there was Kevin and his friend Mark and his friend Lucas and some kid I'd never laid eyes on before. And they were all hovering around Mark's car. The hood was open, and dangling from a chain from some sort of hook-like contraption was an engine. And there were tools everywhere. And when I pulled up in my car, Kevin very tersely said, "Now, Mom, be careful. We're doing an engine swap." I swear, I have never seen anything so intense since the last time I was in the delivery room giving birth to a child. But the problem was that kind of concentration, well, it didn't exactly translate into the classroom. Kevin found school boring. "Oh, really, Mom? It's pointless. It doesn't have anything to do with real life." And so there were failing grades and negative comments on the report card and calls from teachers and meetings with teachers. Kevin doesn't do his homework. Kevin is disruptive. Kevin is sullen. And so I became Helios. "Kevin, you are on a dangerous path. Come on. You need a high school diploma in order to make it in life." Oh, and just like Helios, I knew that advice fell on deaf ears. And so every morning when Kevin went to school, I put on the protective ointment. Only mine came in the form of prayers and worry. Now, David, my husband, and I talked about taking cars away from Kevin, as a sort of punishment to kind of get him on the right path. But every time we talked about it, I said, no. And it was a gut reaction. If someone had asked me why I said no, I couldn't have really explained it. But I can now. Kevin was a gearhead, an artist with cars. Taking things apart and putting them back together, that was the way he expressed himself. It was the way he figured out who he was. And just like Clymene, my job was to help him discover who he was. When Kevin was a junior, he was able to go to BOCES for automotive mechanics. He would go to his regular school in the morning, and in the afternoon he'd go to BOCES. And I would get 2 report cards. It looked as if I had 2 kids. The regular one still had the passing by the skin of your teeth grades and the not so positive comments. But the other one, there were A's and B's. And positive comments. And so there I was at 5:15 driving down the arterial into Poughkeepsie. And traffic was stopped dead. Well, of course it is. It's 5:15, rush hour in Poughkeepsie, and Kevin's car caught on fire in the middle of the arterial. No wonder traffic stopped. Eventually, I did find Kevin and Shauna. Poor Shauna, her face was tear-streaked, and when she hopped into the back, I said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I just started to cry the minute it happened." And when Kevin hopped in the front, I said, "So what did happen?" "We were just driving along, and then all of a sudden I heard this whoosh, and I smelled gas, and I just yelled, 'Get out of the car now.' And we got out, and it burst into flames. And then the fireman came and put it out." Well, that was pretty quick. "Oh, Mom, they were just 2 cars behind." "Well, lucky you." "Oh, Mom, they were such dumbasses. I told them, They were standing there trying to open the hood by the grill. I kept telling them, no, it opens the other way. You have to open it from the back, by the windshield. And all they did was say, "Stand away, son, stand away." The next morning, emblazoned on the front of the Poughkeepsie Journal was a picture of Kevin's car. Flames and black smoke pouring out of the hood, a little gaggle of firemen standing nearby. My husband, through the wonder of the internet, was able to get a copy of the photo. And when he started his presentation that morning, he looked at everybody in front of him and he said, "I don't know how your day began, but that's how my day started." Early that morning, my friend Brenda called. Her son and Kevin were good friends. And she goes, "Lorraine, I see that Kevin's been fixing his car again." "Yep," I said. The caption underneath the picture read, "Kevin Gelardi and passenger were traveling to the Poughkeepsie Galleria when Mr. Gelardi's 1984 BMW 285 burst into flames." Brenda was right. Kevin had been working on his car. He had just graduated from BOCES, and he knew exactly what was wrong with his car. He was going to where he worked at Sears to pick up the right tool so that he could fix it. I remember standing in my dining room window, in front of my dining room window, looking down into the cul-de-sac in front of our house. It had been snowing for a while, and about 5 inches of snow had accumulated on the cul-de-sac. The plows hadn't come yet. And there was Kevin doing donuts in the snow. The front end, coming around the back end. There was snow in graceful arcs spraying out from the rear wheels, the headlights illuminating the falling flakes. Round and round, slow, graceful figure eights, one right after the other. It takes a lot of skill to execute a good donut. You have to be able to ease your foot onto the brake while keeping the other foot on the gas. It's a dance between fear and control. Life is kind of like that. You have your Feyeton moments and your Helios moments. The trick is learning how to balance the two. Thanks for listening. Thank you. Thank you. So our next teller, our final teller, is Sue. She gave me lessons on how to say her last name, so I hope I do it right. Ciampa? Ho, ho, ho. All right. You don't know how hard it is. You read people's names and you have no idea how to pronounce them. Sue is a writer. She started out writing personal narrative, and then somehow she just stumbled upon the wonderful art of storytelling and was able to carry one right into the other seamlessly. Sue Ciampa.
I think I have the shortest mic tonight, which seems appropriate. Am I up on it good? Yeah.
So it's so nice to be here. I mean, the first time I told this story on stage was about 4 years ago here at an open mic, and I've been doing a lot of it since, and I honestly didn't know when the next in-person gig would be, and the fact that it's here is really nice. Lorraine gave a very nice version of what was a very bumpy process. I blame Anne Shirley and Spalding Gray equally, and grateful for both of them. So I was thinking about my first memory of Caffe Lena. I grew up in Saratoga, and I may not be the first one, but it's the one that's strongest is, if you were here before the renovation, people smoked then, so everything was very different, and there was a particular smell. And my mom was very progressive. We were here for some kind of fundraiser or meeting. I was young enough that it was cute that I was under the tables watching people, preparing to be a writer, but just being like a creepy kid. And there was some kind of like donut spread, I thought. So I spy what I think are chocolate donut holes, and I go snag one. Put it in my mouth, definitely not a donut hole. And this other adult sort of laughingly says, "Oh, sweetie, that's a rum ball." And I was like, I don't know what that is, but that's disgusting. Which is my segue to say, the stories that I'm telling tonight are stories for grown-ups. The first one is a little bit of a rum ball, and the second one is just a straight-up adult beverage. So if the kids at home, if you're watching with kids on the live stream, they don't have to go to bed, but they shouldn't stay on the live stream, just as a heads up. This first one won't be as much of a, you won't get drunk off this one. 2 whole dogs? This is what my best friend said to me when I told her that I was considering adopting a pair of dachshunds. And I said, yeah, but they're small, they'll keep each other company. She said again, 2 whole dogs. She had a point. I mean, I had a plan. What life was supposed to look like in order for me to have a dog and raise it right was that I had to have my own place and be fully supporting myself, working from home, have the financial stability and the schedule to raise the dog right. In other words, be an adult. And what life actually looked like at the time was that I was holding down a temp job, and I did have my own place, which was an illegal subdivision of a 1-bedroom apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. It had just enough room to walk around the futon and a 2-burner hot plate as a kitchen. So maybe not the best forever home, but I had so much love to give, So of course I start looking at dachshund rescue websites, and I immediately fall in love with this pair of brother-sister long-haired dachshunds named Francis and Claire, who are sitting side by side in a field of grass, and I immediately fall in love. Here's what I knew about Francis and Claire before I met them. They lived in Concord, New Hampshire. They were described as perfect apartment dogs. And the person who was giving them up, I was told, was a priest who couldn't take them with him where he was going, which I assumed to mean prison, but it could have just been the old priest's home or a rectory that didn't allow pets. Anyway, when I get these dogs to the city, it's clear almost immediately, not only am I unprepared, but I have underestimated that this is not exactly Concord, New Hampshire. I didn't realize my street was littered in chicken bones until I had dogs to walk. And then there are 2 of them, so they're tag teaming. Someone's always eating chicken bones, despite my best efforts. Also, Francis, it turns out, doesn't really want to walk home, which I'll explain. So there are these 2 dogs. They're not really loving the leashes, but Claire is getting it. Francis, when we leave the house, full body, passive resistance, is not going anywhere. So I start carrying him on the walks. I tuck him under my arm. I walk Claire. And I discover by accident that when we get to the end of the walk, if I put him down and say, "Let's go home," he walks like it's the Westminster Dog Show. They also, for perfect apartment dogs, they didn't seem to understand that the half bedroom was the entirety of our home. They thought the building was ours. So people would go up and down the stairs, be talking in the hallway, and they would just go berserk and boom this dachshund bark. If you've not heard it, it's meant to be heard above ground by the German hunters while the dachshunds are dodging for badgers underground. And I got in the bad habit of just throwing Cheerios at them to shush them, which did for a minute, and then it just reinforced the behavior. They got more vigilant. We're all struggling here. And I thought, well, maybe we need to socialize. So we go to the park. We go to Tompkins Square to the dog run. And it's not that they didn't play well with others. They just didn't play with others. They just sit adhered to my sides on this bench and just bark maniacally at this melee of dogs playing. And somehow in their little bit of time in New York, they'd picked up that classic defense mechanism of, if you feel threatened, just act erratically and you'll be given a wide berth. Very astute. And one one of the moms at the park said to me, you can take your dogs off leash in any park before 9 a.m. Okay, great, let's try that. Maybe that'll be our thing. We get up early. We go to Tompkins. We find a nice piece of fenced-in grass. I let Claire and Francis off their leashes, and they just start romping and running, and they're having some kind of like New Hampshire moment. I finally take actually a full breath, and then I see them go down. And when they come up, they're covered in what looks like mud, but it had been particularly dry for weeks. And I realized I was actually saying it out loud to try to process this. Did they just roll in poop? Did they just roll in human poop? And if you're wondering how I know without getting too graphic, let's just say I'd ridden the F train enough times. And I don't know if I mentioned it's hot garbage summer right now. So this is particularly... Anyway, I scream their names to get them to stop. Francis, Claire, they stop rolling and they just start advancing on me. I put out my hands to try to keep them at bay, figure out what to do, and all I can figure out to do is attach their leashes and say, let's go home. But this is the one time Francis will not walk home, just not happening. So it had been a cool enough morning. I'm wearing a hoodie. I take it off. Despite hot garbage summer, it can be quite cold in the mornings. Take off the hoodie. Wrap it around Francis, tuck him under my arm. Keep Claire at a full distance, just hope we don't run into anybody or rub up against anybody on the way home. I get them home, I put them in the tub, because weirdly, the half bedroom had a full bath. I don't remember washing them, but I remember after, sitting on the floor, the dogs passed out on my legs, talking to my mother on the phone, and my mom said, maybe you guys need a break. Maybe the dogs need to come up and see their grandparents. And I, feeling like a failure, but said, okay, and we take the train upstate. As soon as my parents pick us up, as soon as we get to the house, as soon as we get to Saratoga, they open the doors. The dogs, all their neuroses, their city neurosis just fades away. There's a yard, so there's no need for walks. There's 2 retired people sitting in recliners, usually feeding them ham, so they always have a lap, they always have ham. And it's very clear that this is the life they want, and this is nowhere near the life I'm providing them, which just reinforces this constant feeling of like failing them as a mother. Before the weekend is up, I'm standing in the kitchen, my dad comes in, and he says, I talked to Francis, and he said he's not getting back on the train. And he's right. And I can see the dogs out the kitchen window. They're sitting side by side in the grass. And I realize, maybe I'm not supposed to be their forever home. Maybe I'm just supposed to get them there. And once Francis and Claire were settled upstate, I actually didn't stay on the Lower East Side much longer. I stayed about a year, which was just long enough to get my apartment broken into. And after that, I took over a friend's studio in Brooklyn Heights. And this place had a working fireplace, 2 skylights, and an in-unit washer-dryer. Yeah, even for New York. But that sublet came with 2 perfect apartment cats. Thank you. Now, I don't usually title my stories, but this second story does have a title. And this is a triptych on the theme of virginity. The editor-in-chief of Jane magazine needs to know if you've had sex. This is my editor at Jane magazine, who's trying to get this information out of me yet again, and this time she's bringing with her the full weight of the publication. And I know why Jane wants to know if any sailors have been let aboard the ship. I have written an article about losing my virginity for them, so understandable that they want to know. But they don't need to know, and frankly, I'm a little busy trying to lose my virginity in earnest in old school penis and vagina intercourse. And I can tell you that at the time of the article, I had not yet had biblical knowledge sex. I was 24 years old, and I thought about my virginity probably more than anything else. And I was actually very afraid of the pain of physical penetration. See, in college, whenever my boyfriend and I would try to insert tab A into slot B, it was wrenchingly painful. It was very frustrating. We would stop. And after a year or so of this, when I'm 20, I go to a gynecologist. And I hadn't been to the gynecologist before, so I didn't have a point of reference. But I was pretty sure that you're not supposed to be in so much pain that you're sobbing in the stirrups. I would think the doctor might look up, especially if you're shaking the table. This one's not really a talker. But when she's done, I ask her, is it supposed to hurt that much? And she says it's not. And the way she says it makes me feel like she thinks I'm just being overdramatic. So I ask her, is there something wrong with me? And she just sighs, snaps off her gloves, throws them in the garbage, and says, look, you have a small vagina, you may never be comfortable having intercourse, and walks out of the room. I mean, what am I supposed to do with that? How am I supposed to have even the prospect of romantic love if having someone inside me feels anything like that? And this thought like haunts me and stays with me. It grows. It's like the paper that you need to do to finish a class, but you need it not just to pass that class, you need it to graduate. And it really felt like losing my virginity was a prerequisite for the rest of my adult life. This is happening while I'm in college. I have these big plans to move to the city and have this big life, and I just don't want to be a virgin when I find the person that I can fall in love with. So when we get to the point of graduation and nothing has changed, I decide to go back to the gynecologist, a different gynecologist, very lovely woman. I tell her the backstory, and she asks if it's okay to examine me without actually putting anything inside, and I said that would be fine. And she's actually able to tell immediately what's going on. She tells me I have something called an imperforated hymen. And for layman's terms, let's say, if you think of like the paper banner that the football team is gonna run through on their way to the field for the big game, my banner's made out of vinyl. So yeah, the physical force it would take to tear through that, thankfully I had not experienced. But the good news is she tells me there's a very simple procedure, just outpatient, they make a couple incisions, you can just push on through a normal business, fantastic. We do the procedure, and just in time, because I get a job in New York City. I give 0 days notice at the job I had been working up till then, which was at a public TV station run entirely by middle-aged women, because now I'm going to New York to work for a startup where everybody is a dude in their 20s who rides a skateboard to work and plays at abandoned CBGBs on the weekend. So there are plenty of people to potentially make out with and make this happen. And what I should tell you is that the way I was approaching this was as a secret agent on a mission. The main thing was not letting on that I was a virgin. The idea was that I can lose my virginity and then I won't be a virgin anymore. No one will know. And then the virginity never happened, which seems now insane, but totally made sense at the time. So making out served two purposes. First, I was recon to begin with. It was to figure out if the person was doable, which meant, was I attracted enough? Did they seem vaguely safe? 23 years old. And the other was to dare myself to jump off that bridge if we got to it. So I would go in really strong and then immediately lose my nerve. And I'm not working with an extraction team. I'm the only one in there. I'm the only one who can get me out, which means pivot to a blowjob, shut us both up, get out, try again. Cycles of this, nothing's changing. And then actually the worst possible thing happens, which is I meet the contender. I meet someone who I really could fall in love with, and I am indeed still a virgin. And so the contender thought I looked like Rory Gilmore. He was a very good writer, which always gets me. And then he went and quoted Kicking and Screaming to me. And it doesn't matter if you don't know what that is, because he knew what it was. And it was that thing where someone quotes something or references something that's very specific to you that anybody else wouldn't really notice. And it feels very intimate, like they know a part of you even though you just met. And how are you supposed to keep up a cover against that, right? So I don't. I just am honest with him. And as we start to get physical, I just let him know. And he seems pretty cool about it. We actually pivot to a very adult conversation about safe sex and screenings, and I like him so much that I go back to the gynecologist. I'm gonna get the full swab, no free blood test for me at the clinic, not for the contender. So I go back, and even though I know this surgery has worked, I haven't tested it out. So when I'm waiting in the chair for my exam, I'm bracing myself for the pain, because it's all I've ever known. And it doesn't come. And I asked the gynecologist, who's still sitting on the stool in front of me, I was like, hey, while you're in there, could you just tell me if there's anything that makes you believe, that wouldn't be possible, be painful for me to have intercourse? And she just put her hand on my foot and said, honey, there's plenty of room up there. Which was a relief and a revelation. And I'm actually, at this point, I'm feeling very good about completing the mission. Of course, the contender is now nowhere to be found, just completely MIA. And I know I'm the only one to be blamed for, I can only blame myself for getting burned. Like, this is why you don't get emotionally involved with assets. So I'm not feeling the mission at all at this point. I just want to get out of Dodge. So I book a ticket to Austin, Texas. I go to the South by Southwest festival. And while I'm in Austin, I run into this woman who'd been my neighbor when a couple years before we both lived on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. We were actually living in this place called the St. Mary's Home for Working Girls, which sounds like a brothel name for society's most famous virgin. It is not. It's actually a throwback to a time when it was very unseemly for an unmarried woman to be working in the city and living on her own. So it's sort of like a dorm for secretaries that just held over and became the last vestige of three-figure rent for ladies. And we both lived there. Anyway, the girl next door and I, we reconnect in Austin, and we exchange emails. We start writing to each other. And over email, she tells me that she'd had a crush on me. And I tell her that she was my St. Mary's crush. This is all super safe because we're 1,800 miles apart. Like, nothing's going to happen. But then she's in New York for a couple rock shows, and we're just a couple feet apart on the couch in the apartment she's rented for the week. And there's, behind us on the wall, is this very vaginal hand drawing of a cross-section of an onion that was so intense we covered it with a pillowcase. It was the closest we came to acknowledging what was humming between us those first couple days. So we didn't do anything the first night. We didn't do anything the second night. It was actually the night before her last full day in the city when the tension broke. And she gets full credit. She moved in to kiss me. I happened to be getting up at the time, so she kind of got me on the side of the face, and it was delightfully awkward. I just turned in her, kissed her, and then it was on. So the knocking of the boots was happening and continued for basically 24 hours, pretty much until she had to leave for the airport. And at a point during this, while she's inside me, it's none of the things that I expected or feared about penetrative sex. It's not this terror on the high dive, wanting to climb down, feeling like I'm supposed to jump, and I don't know how to dive in the first place. It's none of that. It actually feels like skinny dipping, boundless and immersive, and how the water on your bare skin lights up every nerve ending like the stars at night, which I can tell you are big and bright deep in the heart of Texas. And after this romantic, erotic interlude, she goes back to Texas. I get back on the mission. At this point, I'm a little more prepared. Hymen is managed. Tiny vagina proves capable of expansion. And thanks to the Yellow Rose of Texas, I now know how good it can feel to have somebody inside me. So we just need to check off the penis box, and then we're done with this virginity. A friend sets me up. I meet the setup at KGB Bar, which is actually the bar where we met up, not just because of the spy metaphors. And I'm not really digging the setup, but his friend is at the bar and joins us. And now his friend, he's like a baby face, rocking a full beard. He looks like somebody's little brother, but he's giving me like full body puppy energy, just like eager and adoring. And it's very clear, oh, this is the penis I've been looking for. Great. Except I'm on a date, right? So setup goes to get us a refill on the pitcher, and I slide a napkin across the table to this youngster. I say, that's my number. You're going to call me. We are not going to talk about it. He pockets it. We go for a drink a couple nights later, and then we go back to mine. Clothes are coming off. And I am compelled to tell him, I've had penetrative sex before, just not with a penis. So just if it gets weird, stops him for just a second. He says, sorry, wait, you're a virgin? I just rolled my eyes, handed him a condom, and said, let's land this plane. And it was actually exactly the no-frills commuter flight I needed it to be, got me where I needed to go. After that, I was not a virgin anymore in any sense of the word. And I didn't think about my virginity again, because I really didn't have to. I just, got on with my life. And I know I didn't tell you what that article was about. So you might wonder, how does one write an article about losing their virginity if they haven't completed what a friend used to call the sex act? Well, Jane Magazine had this feature every month called It Happened to Me that was sort of a tragedy overcome first-person essay. And losing my virginity surgically seemed pretty prime for that. In fact, they ran it with a cover line that said, I lost my virginity to my gynecologist. Clickbait used to be on the cover of magazines. So in this article, I talked about those early attempts to have sex in college, the pain, discovering that there was this medical problem, getting it resolved. And I ended the article by saying, as for whether or not I've done the dirty deed, I'll never tell. Some things are just too personal. And I really dug in my heels with my editor not to change that, because I didn't want to say that after all that, especially in print, I didn't want to say after all that, I was still just a scared virgin. And then in my late 30s, about 10 years after fully losing my virginity, I'm at the beginning of a relationship that becomes actually quite a long relationship with this man, and he tells me as we start to get intimate that he's worried that he's going to disappoint me because he's had sex, but he hasn't had intercourse, and he's a virgin. And I tell him what I wish somebody had said to 20 or 23 or 24, 27-year-old virginal Sue. I said, I really like you. Everything so far feels awesome. And when you're ready to do this, you won't be alone because I'm in it with you. And I told him I thought I was really old when I lost my virginity, and it turns out it doesn't really matter. And I said those things to put him at ease, which it seemed to do. But I didn't realize until saying it out loud how much I needed to know it too. Thank you. I know Lorraine already thanked everybody, but I wanted to thank Caffe Lena and Reese and Joe, or Ian. Joe is off, but Joe also, thank you. On behalf of all the tellers and also Christine, Margaret, and Janine, and everybody for coming. I mean, I know this is like a brave new world, and thank you for coming out and being here in person. Please support Caffe Lena in any way you can. This is a great place. If you're coming to Saratoga in the future, come here. If you live here, come check it out. I swear to God, this is the warmest spot on the earth that I've ever been in so far. So thank you guys. Tip your tellers in Caffe Lena if you're online, please. And have a good night. Yay.